I once again welcome everyone to Medico Legal Awareness, and today we have Dr. Subodh Siru with us. Sir, I hand over the mic to you. Thank you and welcome you all. Okay.
Uh, this is Dr. Subodh Shiru. I'm a practicing dermatologist for the last more than 25 years. I've also qualified in the field of law. I've done my master's in law and has been in this field for almost 23 years. We'll be talking about the legal aspects in clinical practice and how to be on the right side of law while we are doing clinical practice. So basically, while we are practicing, there can be certain liabilities that can arise. A simple looking act can result into a liability. Let's try to understand these issues, the legal issues, before we come to certain case laws. Liability basically means an obligation to do something. But when law imposes some liability or some obligation on us to do something, then it's called as a legal liability. You may all recall that in the recent past, there has been a case where a patient was admitted with uh, a condition called as toxic epidermal necrolysis. It's a very severe form of allergy where the patient develops severe burns like condition. Now, this patient was under the care of a physician, a dermatologist in a tertiary care hospital. A certificate was asked from this dermatologist for transfer of this patient from one state to another. As we all know that patients with burns, uh, which is similar to toxic epidermal necrolysis, the patient is highly prone to septicemia. The doctor issued the certificate for the transfer, and this increased the uh, likelihood of septicemia, and within 3 or 4 days after this transfer, the patient died. A complaint was filed uh, at three different levels. So let's see what are the different liabilities that could arise and what happened in that particular case. The first kind of liability is called as a civil liability. Before the enactment Consumer Protection Act in 1986, the patients or their legal representatives would have to go to a regular civil court, but that was a very tardy process. Consumer Protection Act gave them a ray of hope, and cases started being filing there. Now, what is the basic principle in a civil liability? If there is any loss or damage, like in that case, the patient died of septicemia, so there was the death of the patient, and compensation for the death of the patient was sought. So the objective in case of a civil liability is to have something called as status quo ante. That means putting the legal representative in a position, a financial position in which she or he would have been if that death or that event would not have happened. So in brief, it means compensation is payable for any loss, injury, or death of the patient. The other forum where an aggrieved patient or his legal representatives could go is a professional misconduct. A complaint could lie before the State Medical Council or uh, under the National Medical Commission Act, which has now replaced the Medical Council of India Act, the Ethics and Medical Registration Board. So a complaint can lie before the State Medical Council or it can go directly to the national level. So in this case, the case of 10 that we were talking about, a complaint was filed not only before the consumer fora, claiming a compensation of 77 crore, which is one of the highest that has been sought so far in any case in this country. A complaint was also filed before the State Medical Council, but the State Medical Council dismissed that complaint, saying that there was no negligence on the part of the doctors. Let's see that the State Medical Council, contrary to what a civil court can give, a civil court can give compensation, whereas a State Medical Council can reprimand the doctor, or it can recommend the removal of the name from the register, or it can be permanent, or it can be temporary, depending on the severity of the professional misconduct. So the relief that is sought under different liabilities is different. In that particular case, the husband of that particular lady who passed away, a criminal complaint was also filed under section 304A of the Indian Penal Code, because there was death allegedly because of the rash and negligent act of the doctors. What is the purpose of criminal liability? The purpose is to punish the offender. In contrary to a civil liability where it is to award compensation, professional misconduct where it is to punish the doctor with respect to his right to practice. Here it is to punish the offender, and the punishment is in the form of penalty, that is some amount may be recovered from him or her, or there can be imprisonment, or it can be both. So what is this section 304A IPC, which is generally applied to doctors when death happens? So whenever there is death of a patient and there are allegations that there has been rashness or negligence on the part of the doctors in treating that particular patient, and because of this negligence the patient has died, then this section is generally applied. Now what happens if death does not happen? There are other sections, section 336, 337 and 338, which apply when death does not happen. Very important to note in this case that all these sections that I just mentioned, right from 336, 337, 338 and 304A, all are bailable offenses. That means you do not have to go to a court to seek anticipatory bail. The bail is a matter of right in most of these cases. So now let us go on to understand what is meant by medical negligence, because what happens is a lot of time the patient or the patient's relative, if they are aggrieved by the treatment given by the doctor or the hospital, they will allege negligence. They will give threats of suing the doctor. When we do not know, the doctor gets scared and he doesn't know how to deal with that particular problem. The idea is, first of all, we should know we have to do a self-assessment whether I have been really negligent in this case or not. And if I do that self-assessment and I know that there has been no negligence on my part, then I have nothing to worry. So what are the components of medical negligence? The first important component is whether there is any breach of duty of care. All of us have some duty of care while we treat our patients. So this duty of care, if we breach, then that's the first component of medical negligence. Let's take a simple example of, we give a penicillin test dose before we give the full dose of penicillin. Okay, we'll take this simple example for our understanding. So if I fail to give the test dose, then I have breached my duty of care in administering the test dose of penicillin. But is it sufficient that I do not give the test dose, then I'm held negligent? No. Merely by breaching a duty of care, I cannot be held negligent. So what is the second component? In addition to breach of duty of care, there has to be some loss or injury or death of the patient. So merely not giving the test dose is not enough. But if the patient suffers because of not administering the test dose, then it can be the second step to hold the doctor medically, negligent in the treatment. Now, are these two components also enough? No. It's very important that there has to be a relationship, a direct and proximate relationship between the breach of duty of care or the loss or injury or death of the patient. Let's take the same example. Supposing I do not give the test dose, but the patient dies of an acute myocardial infarction, which can happen in any patient despite taking precautions prior to the surgery. So the patient has died not because I failed to give the test dose, but the patient has died because of some other condition which is not related to the failure or breach of my duty of care. Let's understand this, but obviously, if the patient has acute MI, you need to treat for acute MI. You cannot say that that component should not be taken care of. So when would a doctor be held negligent? If there is all these three components. I'll give you one example which was decided by the Supreme Court of India. A ENT surgeon was operating for septoplasty, and before doing the operation, the patient was taken in the operation theater. Lignocaine sensitivity was being done. The patient was sensitive to the test dose of lignocaine, and he went into cardiac arrest. All that was required to be done to resuscitate the patient was done. A cardiologist who was available in the nursing home also was brought in, and they all tried to resuscitate the patient, but the patient died. Let's apply this in this particular components and see whether the patient was negligent or not. So what was the first component? Breach of duty of care. So was there any breach of duty of care? Of course not, because the test dose of lignocaine was being given. The patient was sensitized to sensitive to that test dose. The patient developed a reaction. All due care was given to that patient to take care of the sensitivity, the reaction that the patient developed. The death has not happened because of any breach of duty of care. So I hope this is understood what is medical negligence and when it becomes actionable. So a lot of cases may be filed, but it may not stand the legal scrutiny unless all these three components are satisfied. So what?
Uh,
Hello.
doctor, under medical negligence, I have few questions coming up here.
Sure.
So the first question is something like this: if fined liable under a law, doctor loses his or her degree or registration or both.
Sorry. Come again.
If fined liable under a law, doctor loses his degree or registration or both.
Okay. It depends where the complaint is filed. Like I said, a complaint may be filed in a civil case in a consumer court, or it can be filed before the state medical council, or it can be in a criminal court. So if it is filed before the medical council alone has the powers to restrict or to remove the right to practice. No other court has it, but the other courts can give a direction to the medical council to conduct a disciplinary proceeding under the respective medical council act, and the decision whether the patient should continue, the doctor should continue with the right of practice or not will be decided. So unless
Okay.
that complaint is filed.
Okay. There is next question, doctor, from Dr. Rahul Tripathi.
Okay.
Does drug ADRs qualifies as negligence if we do not explain it to the patients, since most drugs have multiple ADRs?
Okay. Uh, with respect to drug, we are going to just talk about the duty of care. So while we are deciding what treatment to give, it's very imperative that we ask the patient whether he has history of any drug allergies, any known drug allergies. If the patient has been taking treatment for any other condition, we should be knowing whether there would be any drug interactions. we should also record that whether there has been any known history of drug allergy. If any test dose needs to be given, that has to be also given. Merely because a drug reaction happens does not mean there has been negligence on the part of the doctor. Because we all know any drug can throw up any side effects. So unless you have not asked the history, not recorded it, or you have not, given advice to the patient that you follow up, you stop the medication if any side effect occurs, and follow up for further treatment. If the patient is under your indoor patient care, then you have to obviously look for signs and symptoms of a drug reaction. Hope I have answered that question. Hello.
Sure, doctor. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So we go on to the duties of care. While deciding a case in 1969, the Supreme Court said that there are three fundamental duties of care when we treat any patient. First is in deciding whether to undertake to treat a patient. What does this mean? Supposing a patient comes to me as a dermatologist with some pain in the right iliac fossa, so which is suspected to be appendicitis. So this is beyond my qualification. So I decide not to undertake to treat this patient and refer it to a surgeon who is competent to handle that malignancy. So I need to have the qualification. Now, supposing a patient comes to me for Botox treatment and I am not skilled in the management or giving Botox injections, then I should refer him to another dermatologist who is qualified to do. So before I undertake to treat a patient, I should decide whether I have the qualification and the skills to treat that particular ailment that the patient is suffering from. Once you have decided that you can treat him, next is in deciding what kind of treatment will you give. Whether it will be surgical line of treatment, it will be medical line of treatment, or you may not treat. Sometimes you have to only give reassurance. It could be anxiety or something like that. So deciding the right kind of treatment. The third important duty of care is in manner of administration of the treatment. What does this mean? So if a test dose has to be given, you have to give that. If you have opened the abdomen, before closing the abdomen, you make sure there are no mobs, no gauze pieces left behind. So a failure in any of this duty of care will result in a finding of negligence. Okay. So what are the defenses in the case of alleged medical negligence? Why should we know this as doctors? Will our lawyers not handle this? Lawyers need to be explained the medical aspects so that they will translate it into a legal form and present it to the court. They will not know what is an accepted professional practice. They will not know what the standard protocols in the management of that particular condition is. That is why we need to explain it to them. So along with the references or maybe affidavits of our experts in that field, so that that can be presented to the court. So the important defenses that one can take in case of an alleged medical negligence is accepted professional practice. So if you have treated a patient with a standard protocol and despite that the patient dies, say a case of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, you treat with corticosteroids, the patient develops a loss of vision, which is known with this kind of patients, then it is not negligence merely because a morbidity or mortality happened. The negligence has to be proved. If you have treated as per standard protocols, you will not be held negligent. Second important defense that one can take is what is known as a bona fide error of judgment. We just talked about pain in right iliac fossa. One of the diagnoses, of course, is acute appendicitis, but a patient can also develop pain in right iliac fossa due to something else in that particular region. So if your primary diagnosis on clinical basis has been an error, it does not mean that you are negligent. Of course, if time is on your side, if investigations are available, then you should get it done. Otherwise, you could be held negligent. Third important defense is an informed consent. How does informed consent become a defense? What does informed consent mean? It basically means it's like a risk bond. There are risks which are inherent in any type of procedure, treatment, or management. So the patient undertakes that risk which are associated with those procedures, the surgical procedures, all the cytotoxic drugs that have been given to the patient. So informed consent protects the doctor if there is no negligence, but you are doing it as per accepted professional practice. One more important defense is a law of limitation. You cannot go to a court of law after a very long time. Under different laws, like under Consumer Protection Act, a complaint can be filed within 2 years of happening of that event. That is called as a cause of action. So if you go beyond 2 years, you have to explain why you could not come in 2 years. Supposing a patient goes into coma for 6 months, then he gets 6 months additional period to file the complaint, because at that point of time he was unable to file the complaint. So that is called as law of limitation. So a very classic example of accepted professional practice is Dr. C.P. Srikumar versus S. Ramanujan. What happened in this case was the patient met with an accident while he was riding a bicycle, and he sustained a hairline fracture of the right femur. There are different ways in this hairline fracture can be managed. Either a hemiarthroplasty can be done or an internal fixation procedure can be done. So both of these are accepted professional practices. So if you choose one over the other, simply because you have chosen one of the two does not hold you negligent. This was explained to the patient that there are various modes, and the recommended method that he chooses is hemiarthroplasty. The patient consented to it, and the court dismissed the particular complaint. We were talking about the law of limitation. This was an interesting case that happened where a patient was operated for cholecystectomy by the open method in the year 1993. What happened interestingly was in November 2002, she went to another surgeon, uh, and after the surgery, it was found that there was a gauze piece left for nearly 9 years from the date of the surgery. This particular patient was a qualified nurse, and she was in the profession. For all these 9 years, she bore with the pain, and what she did is she kept on taking analgesics on her own. I just mentioned a little while ago that the law of limitation can be extended if the patient is not aware that the uh, pain is because of the gauze piece. Of course, she would not have known whether gauze piece is left behind, but definitely she knew there was pain and there's something wrong, and she should have followed up with the operating surgeon. But since she did not follow up with that concerned surgeon, that is why the law of limitation was not extended, and the condonation of delay was not done in the case. So next we come to importance of medical records. So basically medical records are a reflection of the treatment given. It's also the continuity of treatment, right? As per the code of medical ethics, we should maintain the medical records with respect to the indoor case papers for a period of 3 years from the commencement of the treatment. And if the patient or the legal representatives of the patient ask for the medical records, a photocopy of the medical records, it should be given to them within 72 hours of such request or demand. Okay. Next is about informed consent. Informed consent, this is culled out from a Supreme Court judgment, uh, Samira Kohli versus Dr. Prabha Machanda. Now, in this case, what had happened is the patient was a 42-year-old lady who had bleeding PV, and she presented to the gynecologist, who said that let us do a diagnostic test. So she was taken in the OT for a diagnostic procedure. The consent also was taken for the diagnostic procedure, but when she was wheeled out from the operation theater, her uterus, the salpinx, the ovaries were all removed. The defense of the doctor was she started bleeding during the diagnostic procedure, and therefore I had to do this massive procedure. The consent was taken from the mother of the lady who was sitting outside the OT. So certain guidelines were laid down in this particular judgment, and the Supreme Court said we all know that consent should be real and valid. There should be capacity. That means the patient should be of a sound mind and competent to consent. A minor cannot consent. The guardian has to consent on behalf of the minor. Anyone above 18 years of age can consent for any procedure done on him or her. It has to be voluntary, and very important is adequate information concerning the nature of the treatment or procedure should be given. People very often ask, what should be the components of an informed consent? How lengthy it should be? Should it include everything? So these were the guidelines that were laid, that adequate information means these four important things: the nature and procedure of the treatment and its purpose and effect. So these details, like if you are going to do appendectomy, you have to say the nature and procedure. Let's remember one thing: when it's an emergency procedure, uh, you need not explain in detail because it's not possible, right? This applies generally in cold cases. In emergency, you have to explain in brief. Second is alternatives, if any, available. Whether conservative line of treatment is possible, because interval appendectomy is also done. So if alternatives, if any, should be explained to the patient. What are the risks that should be explained? The risk depends on patient to patient. Like if you're doing an excision of a cyst which is present on the forehead, the risk depends on the age, the comorbidities that the patient is having. Say a 80-year-old male comes to you with IHD and many other comorbidities. Obviously, the risk is higher, and you can explain to the patient, if you are not getting any complaints because of the cyst, it can be left alone. Whereas in an 18-year-old, you are not expecting a lot of complications. The risk is more cosmetic. So the risk differs from patient to patient. Lastly, what are the adverse consequences of refusing treatment? This has come from a Kerala High Court judgment where a patient of acute appendicitis was not operated, developed perforation of the appendix, and died of perforative peritonitis. The defense of the doctor was that consent was not given in this particular case, and therefore I did not operate. So the Supreme Court as well as the Kerala High Court in that particular case said that if somebody is refusing any line of treatment, you have to explain what could be the possible adverse consequences of refusing this treatment. What need not be explained? All fantastic risks need not be explained. Something which is remote need not be explained, because death can happen with even a simple excision of a cyst. You need not explain that in a 18-year-old in a manner to frighten him so that he refuses any kind of treatment from you. Same way, you should not give all remote or theoretical risks which are very fanciful. Now you bought a laser machine and you tell the patient, unless you go for a laser therapy, this risk can happen, that kind of risk can happen. which is really, really remote. So we come to what is a legal notice. We all, a lot of our colleagues get legal notice. We hear about legal notice. Do not ignore if a legal notice is issued to us, and do not reply impulsively also. Many a times the legal notice says that pay this amount of say 1 crore within 7 days, otherwise I'll go to a court of law. Do not worry, get all the details, assess whether there has been any negligence on your part, get all your medical records in place, see whether everything is in order, and then you can reply along with the help of your uh, legal representative or a lawyer. Similarly, a notice from a consumer commission should also not be ignored. A consumer commission or consumer dispute redressal agencies or consumer courts as they are called. These consumer courts, though they are strictly not courts, but they're called as quasi-judicial authorities, they have powers to imprison someone or arrest a person if there is non-compliance of their order. So if you ignore, do not appear in the court, do not give your defense, and the order goes against you, then uh, an order to imprison or to sell off your property, attach your property and sell it off, these provisions are also present. So again, when one gets a notice from a consumer commission or a consumer fora, it is important to take a self-assessment check and see whether you've been negligent or not. Keep all your medical records in place. Seek help of your professional colleagues. Read relevant medical literature on that and keep it handy so that it can be produced in court of law as evidence. Amicable settlement. When should you go for a amicable settlement? Go whenever you find it is appropriate, whenever you feel that the case is indefensible. If there is a cause piece left, there is hardly any defense you have. You will go on for this case for years together, and then you see that uh, the matter is lingering over your head for years together. So finally, the outcome may not be in favor. So it is always uh, advisable to go for a settlement, especially if the patient side, comes forward for a discussion on a settlement. But when you settle a case, it's very important that you have what is known as a memorandum of settlement in place. What is this memorandum of settlement? It is like an agreement between the parties concerned in which it is mentioned that two things should be mentioned: that you do not admit negligence on your part. This is given to, and this whatever compensation or whatever amount you are paying to the patient or the legal representative is in the uh, it's a complete payment towards present as well as all future claims, and do not offer cash or accept liability. If you have an insurance policy, a professional indemnity policy, make sure that you inform the your insurance company, because if you make the payment without taking their concurrence, they will not settle the claim that you will make. Okay. So we come to what is a professional indemnity policy. A lot of senior doctors or some doctors who say that I practice the right way. I do all accepted professional practices. Do I need a professional indemnity policy? A indemnity policy is important even if you are doing everything right. Why is this so? Because a professional indemnity policy not only covers compensation if made payable by a court of law, but also it covers defense costs. Let's remember that cases that are filed may not always be genuine. They may be because of some misconceptions or instigation of some other doctor or some NGO or someone else or a relative of a patient who has instigated them to file this particular case. So in such a case, the defense costs have to be borne. You have to employ a lawyer. Of course, not always. The case that I mentioned about that ENT surgeon where lignocaine was given, the owner of that particular nursing home fought the case himself. We need to have the knowledge, the capability to handle that. So a professional indemnity policy will help you not only with the compensation if payable, but also with the defense costs. Now we come to what is known as telemedicine practice guidelines. In the recent past, in the year 2018, there was a High Court decision on uh, refusal of anticipatory bail uh, to two doctors whose patient died after telephonic consultation. We all must be aware of this. There was a scare after there was this rejection of an anticipatory bail for these two doctors. Now, what happened in this case is the patient was operated in that particular nursing home, and after a few days, this patient came with nausea, vomiting. The doctors were not available in that nursing home at that point of time, and they asked the staff that were present in the nursing home to give particular anti-emetic. Unfortunately, the patient did not respond, and it was found later on that the patient had pulmonary embolism. So that was the reason why the anticipatory bail was refused in that particular case. But let's remember that the Supreme Court stayed that particular decision of the High Court. As an outcome of the fear that was created whether telephonic consultation is permissible or not, further, with the outbreak of COVID-19, where distance can be a problem, I mean, a distance factor could come into play. On 25th of March 2020, that is a few days ago, these practice guidelines were issued, and they are inserted in the Medical Council of India Act. So it has a statutory stamp on it, and it is mentioned in Appendix 5 of the Medical Council of India Act. So what is telemedicine and telehealth? Both have been defined under these guidelines. So telemedicine is basically very important to note the difference between the two. Telemedicine is the delivery of the healthcare services. So who gives healthcare services? The registered medical practitioner or the healthcare professional, and where the distance is a critical fact. So the patient cannot come to you for a consultation, in-person consultation. So you deliver the healthcare services through a telecommunication method. Second is telehealth. Now, what is telehealth? This is a broader term. So the delivery of health and health-related services, including medical care. So this is not limited only to doctors, but other health uh, professionals can also, whatever services are given by them is included under the term of telehealth. What we are concerned as far as doctors are concerned is telemedicine. What are the exclusions for telemedicine? Whether all treatments are included under telemedicine or not, there are limitations. So the specifications for hardware or software or the infrastructure, the maintenance is not mentioned in the guidelines. They are not concerned with that. They're concerned only with the healthcare related services. The use of digital technology to conduct the surgery or invasive procedure remotely is not permissible under this particular guidelines. Also, it does not provide for consultations which are outside the jurisdiction of India. So you cannot consult someone who is sitting in the USA or UK. Okay. So who all can practice telemedicine? Only those who are called RMPs. RMPs are registered medical practitioners, and those are called as RMPs who are registered under the Indian Medical Council of India Act 1956, either with the respective state medical council or with the Medical Council of India. Now, what the guidelines say that an online program will be developed, and this will be a mandatory program will have to be, you have to undergo that program before you can practice telemedicine. But this online program is still not available. So in the meantime, in the interim period, before these guidelines come into play, you can practice the telemedicine using the guidelines that are present in the Medical Council of India Act. Okay, but after the period of 3 years, if you want to continue practicing telemedicine, you have to mandatorily undergo and qualify in such a course. So what are the steps in telemedicine? First step is the context. It's very important that when a RMP or a doctor talks to his patient over a telecommunication, hello, yeah, with the telecommunication method, then he should assess whether this patient can be treated by telemedicine or not. So a patient who has an acute abdomen, somebody who has trauma, can he be treated with telemedicine? Of course not. So the first assessment is whether it is appropriate to do telemedicine for that particular patient or not. This correlates well with the duty of care that we had discussed some time ago. We said the first duty of care is in deciding whether I should undertake to treat that particular patient or not. So every patient that presents to me for telemedicine, I should not be treating by telemedicine unless it is appropriate to treat him by telemedicine. So that is the first step in telemedicine. Second is an identification process. Once you have decided that one can go for telemedicine in this particular case, you have to take the identification details of the patient, the name, age, the address of that patient, email address, telephone number. All this details have to be taken from the patient. They have to be recorded. If you have a doubt that the patient is a minor, you can ask for age proof, and if it's a minor, the patient has to be accompanied by guardian for telemedicine. It's not only the patient who has to identify himself or herself, the RMP also has to do the same. He has to give his credentials, his name, before he goes ahead with the telemedicine. Next step is the modes of telemedicine. How will this telemedicine be conducted? It can be in the form of audio, there can be a telephonic discussion, it can be visual, or it can be a text, say an email or a WhatsApp message. All these are possible, but you have to, as a prudent doctor, see which is appropriate for that particular condition. Say, can we have a telemedicine consultation for a dermatological condition without visual? It's not possible. So in dermatological conditions, visual is a must, right? Next is a patient consent. A patient's consent is implicit. That means it is accepted to be present if the patient himself is opting for telemedicine. When is it explicit? When there is a caregiver involved. Some patients cannot ask for a consultation directly. They do it through a caregiver. So in such cases, explicit consent in the form of an email or a message should be taken from the patient's behalf. Next important, once you have taken the consent, you have to see what kind of consultation is this. Is this a first consultation or a follow-up consultation? A first consultation is one which is you are doing the consultation for the first time. So generally it should be a video calling. A follow-up consultation is beyond 6 months from the first consultation. Okay. If the patient comes to you within the 6 months, but for a different condition altogether, which is not connected to the ailment that he was suffering when he had the first consultation, then it doesn't qualify to be a follow-up consultation. It's still a first consultation. Next is the patient evaluation. You have to evaluate the patient as though you are doing a in-person consultation. You will have to ask the age, the history, the duration of ailment, the sign and symptoms that the patient is suffering from. If you want to ask for certain additional documents, investigations, then you should ask for that. The consultation is paused till such time that those investigation reports are given or further information is given. Lastly is the patient management. Now, depending on the condition that the patient is suffering from, you could give health education if treatment is not possible. That means you say that you should abstain from alcohol if patient has got, say, gastritis. So avoid spicy food. This is a health education. Second is counseling. Say a patient of cancer on chemotherapy. So you can counsel what are the do's and don'ts in such cases without giving specific treatment, because in such cases specific treatment will be an in-person consultation. Until such time the patient goes for an in-person consultation, the counseling may help to a certain extent. The last step is in prescribing medicines. So can medicines be prescribed in all cases? There are categories of medicines that can be prescribed that is mentioned in the guidelines. The first list is O, which is safe to prescribe through teleconsultation. These are basically OTC products or very safe products, and they are deemed to be necessary in public health emergencies. So, say paracetamol, cough syrups, or lozenges, all this can be prescribed through teleconsultation. Next is list A, those in list A. So if they are prescribed during first consultation, but there is video calling, so these drugs can be prescribed. It can be a refill on a follow-up. So the patient had a in-person consultation with you and follows up on a telecommunication mode, then you can refill the same treatment after a evaluation of the patient. These drugs have to be having low potential for abuse. A very important point is the list B. Prescribed for follow-up consultation in addition to those prescribed for the in-person consultation for the same medical condition. So if a patient has come for the first time for diabetes mellitus, you started the patient on metformin, the patient does not respond, you want to add a gliptin. So if you are adding a additional drug for the same medical condition, that's diabetes mellitus type 2, then you can do that under the list B. The next list is the most important list, a prohibited list. Which are the drugs which are prohibited? Drugs in Schedule X or drugs under the narcotic and psychotropic drugs. The reason is there is a high potential for abuse. So a psychiatrist cannot prescribe drugs which have potential for abuse or drugs which are prohibited under this particular list. Okay. In such cases, in-person consultation is required, and then only these drugs can be prescribed. So what are the duties and responsibilities as far as these telemedicine is concerned? We are bound to maintain the same amount of privacy and confidentiality. Especially, we cannot misuse the patient's images and data that are sent to us. So we have to maintain the confidentiality. We cannot have advertising. The Code of Medical Ethics prohibits advertising for soliciting patients. Same way, we cannot advertise to solicit patients for telemedicine also. We cannot prescribe drugs from prohibited list. And if we prescribe drugs without a provisional diagnosis or any kind of diagnosis, it has been specifically mentioned that it can amount to a professional misconduct. Very important, like we talked about maintaining documentation, same way here also, when there is a teleconsultation, we need to maintain the documentation in form of all logs of whatever, or the emails that have been sent, what are investigation reports that have been sent for our assessment. We can charge for this consultation, and we have to issue receipts also. We can issue receipts, but like any other documentation, any other prescription, we need to mention, as any other prescription, the number of days. The drug has to be in the generic and not the brand name. There has to be signature, name of the doctor, and the registration number of that particular doctor. The receipts should also bear the uh, registration number and the name of the doctor. Now hello, we are in the midst of a outbreak, and we are hearing particular sections, certain legal provisions. The idea of going through this particular section is to sensitize or to create awareness about these particular sections and how far it may apply to us. Section 269 and 270 of the IPC. What does 269 of the Indian Penal Code say? That a negligent act likely to spread infection of disease which is dangerous to life or safety of others. So if we do not take precautions to minimize the risk of transmission to others, now this does not apply only to doctors, but even patients who are under, say, quarantine, and they breach the terms of the quarantine and they wander around, it applies to them also. Some people may indulge in a deliberate act. It's not only negligent, but a vicious manner or a malicious manner. They would like to roam about so that they can go around spreading infection. Then Section 270 of the Indian Penal Code Act applies. We hear about Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code. So what is this? Basically, an executive magistrate can direct any person from doing certain thing or expecting someone to do something uh, if there is a need to prevent some danger to human life, health, or safety. So a lot of such executive orders have been issued so that there is no unlawful assembly, that is 4 or more people in one area, or a lockdown in certain areas, containment, so that the risk of transmission is reduced. So there is an act, Epidemic Diseases Act. This was in the British era in 1897. Actually, this act was an outcome of the plague that happened in 1986, and there was a need to have a law to prevent or the spread of transmission of contagious diseases, and some powers that should vest with the state or central government. So that act is also being used. It's a very small act of 4 or 5 provisions, but that act empowers the government to issue directions to various persons, and we are bound by those directions. Now, Epidemic Diseases Act 1897, the powers are more with the state government. The central government has very minimal powers under that act. So what has been invoked by the central government, because they have to take care of the whole country and not individual states, So they have invoked the Disaster Management Act. So we need to comply with the directions that are given by these particular orders. So this is in brief about the legal aspects of clinical practice. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Uh, be safe, medico-legally, also from the outbreak. Thank you very much.
Dr. Shubodh, we have few questions here.
Sure.
So the first question is, what is ESMA Act?
Okay. It's not ESMA Act. It is a body that is established under National Medical Commission Act. We all know that Medical Council of India Act is being repealed and replaced by National Medical Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Okay.
so that is yet to come into force. But till such time, Medical Council of India has been replaced by the Board of Governors. So the new act talks about ethics and medical registration board. Okay, so
Okay.
instead of the Medical Council of India, whenever that comes
Mm-hmm.
into force, a complaint will lie before that particular body instead of Medical Council of India. Okay.
Okay. We have a second question. What are the medico-legal aspects in teledermatology?
As we discussed, if we do not take the guidelines as they are stated, like if we prescribe anything from the prohibited drugs, if we do not give the prescription, a prescription has to be given like a prescription, like the name has to be there, the registration number has to be there, the generic name of the drug has to be mentioned, your registration number should be mentioned. If we do not comply with these guidelines, then we can be held liable for
Mm.
professional misconduct. So all the other principles with respect to privacy, confidentiality, issuing prescriptions, all this will apply as it is in a in-person consultation. All cases cannot be treated by telecommunication methods. There are limitations of telemedicine. So expecting to treat a psychiatric patient who is, say acute psychosis using telemedicine may not be possible. So as I said, the first step for telemedicine is seeing whether it is appropriate to use this method for telemedicine or not.
Great. So the third question, doctor,
Yeah.
how long do we need to keep records for OPD consultations?
It is not stated for how long it is to be kept. Now, going by what the current guidelines talk about is 3 years from the commencement of the treatment. So currently it can be kept for 3 years. Let's remember one thing, that it also mentions, the guidelines mention that newer drugs may be added to this list. So what is prohibited today may not be prohibited tomorrow. There can be
Mhm.
changes. These are dynamic things. These guidelines have been issued just on 25th of March. The changes may happen from time to time.
We have one more question from Dr. Kalyan Chakravarti. I'm a psychiatrist and have a specific question. I noticed that telemedicine practice guidelines March 2020 issued by BOG prohibit psychiatric drug prescription over tele consultation. My patients are at high risk of relapse withdrawal on stopping this medication. Please advise about repeat prescription of below drugs over tele consultation. Those are antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs.
Yeah, as I got the question, as we discussed a little while ago, it's
Mm-hmm.
very clearly under the prohibited list of drugs, and these drugs are having a potential of abuse, and current guidelines say that it cannot be given by telemedicine. Let's understand, telemedicine is not meant to be a substitute for a in-person consultation. It has to be used in certain circumstances where distance is a critical factor. So it cannot be used as a complete substitute for a in-person consultation.
Yeah. And the other one, doctor,
Yeah.
do the medico legal aspects apply to OP consultation? If my OP sheet contains a state that not valid for medico legal purpose, will it help?
Okay. The by stating that this is not for medical legal purposes, you cannot contract out of a law. There's something called as a law cannot be contracted out of. That means you can't enter into an agreement by saying that you are actually entering into an agreement with the patient that you cannot use this for any purpose which is medico legal. The whether it has legal importance or not is decided by courts, not by us. We cannot say that this particular report cannot be used for medical legal purpose. This just gives us a false reassurance that this cannot be carried in a court of law, right?
Okay, probably the last one. We have so many questions. So at the end, we'll be giving a mail ID of you, Shubodh sir. But this question says something like this. Can a health worker legally refuse to treat the patients in an epidemic like this if he or she is provided with proper PPE?
Okay. I was expecting this question and a little difficult to answer. But as I said, this whenever order or a direction is passed under Section 144 CRPC or under the Epidemic Diseases Act or under Disaster Management Act, we are bound, legally bound to uh, obey those orders. So that is the legal position.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much. Can you please pull the last slide where they can get my mail ID and all the attendees, doctors, I'm posting Subodh Sirur's mail ID there. You can reach out for him any sort of questions. Hope that is okay, doctor.
Yeah, that's fine. But I'm
Mail
seeing,
ID, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. You can pick up if there is anything scope for you to have proper answers for the questions over there.
You want my email ID to be displayed? This is showing
Yeah,
Ravi's, yeah,
I think it's in the
first slide.
I think it's in the first slide. Yeah, first
Okay,
slide.
okay. I'll just go to that.
Okay.
Just a disclaimer to mention the interpretation is basically on the current judgments and the current laws. So laws keep on changing from time to time. So always we need to refer to the latest laws and let us understand that this program, this session is particularly to create legal awareness and it's not a substitute for legal advice. So in particular cases, you may have to seek legal advice from your lawyer or legal expert in those particular cases. Okay, this has my email ID. Yeah,
Yes, doctor.
yeah.
Doctor, thank you so much for taking us through deep dive with the medical legal, awareness in terms of obligation to do something, legal ability, legal liability obligation under law to do something. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the doctors who attended and been so much patient and giving their questions.